High Arbiter Joran stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the stars bend around his fleet as they traveled through hyperspace at speeds no human vessel could match. He was the commander of the Valkyrie 9th Conquest Fleet, and today would mark the beginning of humanity's end as a free species in the galaxy. 800 warships followed his command, carrying 500,000 of the Dominion's finest soldiers, and they were heading toward a species that had only discovered faster than light travel 3 centuries ago. The Valkyrie Dominion had conquered thousands of worlds over 12,000 years, and they had never once failed to bring a primitive species to heel. Joran reviewed the intelligence reports on his holographic display and felt nothing but contempt for these creatures called humans. They had colonized only 40 star systems, and they could not even unite under a single government. Some worlds belonged to something called the Earth Coalition, while others were controlled by corporations or operated as independent territories that barely spoke to each other. The reports classified humans as technologically adolescent, politically fragmented, and psychologically predictable. His analysts estimated the conquest would take 60 solar cycles at most, and Joran privately believed he could do it in 30. "We exit hyperspace in 10 units, announced his navigation officer. Joran straightened his ceremonial armor and prepared to witness the first step in what would surely be remembered as the easiest conquest in Dominion history. The fleet emerged from hyperspace above a world called New Harvest, a farming colony that provided food for 7 other human systems. Taking it first would starve the humans into submission and show them the futility of resistance. Joran expected to see defensive satellites, patrol ships, perhaps even a desperate transmission begging for mercy. Instead, he saw nothing. No ships rose to challenge them, and no satellites targeted their approach. The planet below showed cities and infrastructure, but every scanner reading indicated the same impossible thing. "Report," Joran demanded, his voice carrying an edge of confusion he did not like. "High Arbiter, the colony appears to be abandoned," his sensor officer replied with uncertainty in his tone. "Scan again," Joran ordered. "We have scanned 17 times, High Arbiter, and there is no biological life above bacterial level anywhere on the planet's surface." Joran felt the first whisper of unease touch his mind, but he pushed it away with the confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. The humans had likely fled when they detected the fleet approaching, and that meant they were cowards who would be easy to hunt down. "Send the occupation force to secure the colony infrastructure," he commanded. 50 troop transports descended toward the planet's surface while Joran watched from orbit. His soldiers would secure the grain silos, the processing facilities, and the transportation hubs. When the humans returned to beg for their food supplies, they would find Valkyrie warriors waiting for them. The transports landed in perfect formation around the colony's capital city, and soldiers poured out to secure key positions. Reports came in steadily as squads swept through empty streets and entered silent buildings. Everything was intact but abandoned, as if the entire population had simply vanished overnight. Joran was about to order a wider search pattern when his communications officer suddenly went pale. "High Arbiter, we are detecting unusual energy signatures from the planet's surface." Before Joran could ask for clarification, the main view screen flashed white. 12 fusion warheads detonated simultaneously across the colony's agricultural district, each one hidden beneath a grain silo that the Valkyrie had been so eager to capture. The explosion was perfectly synchronized, creating a cascade of destruction that consumed everything within a 50-kilometer radius. 47 Valkyrie ships that had moved into low orbit for the ground operation were caught in the blast wave and torn apart. 15,000 soldiers on the surface died in an instant, incinerated by the very resources they had come to steal. Joran gripped his command throne as his flagship shook from the shockwave, and for the first time in his career, he felt the cold grip of genuine fear. How did they know we were coming? He demanded. No one on the bridge could answer him. The humans had evacuated their colony days before the fleet arrived, and they had turned their own world into a trap designed specifically to kill Valkyrie soldiers. This was not the behavior of a primitive species, and this was not the response of frightened prey. As the flames on the planet below began to fade, Juran's communication console activated with an incoming transmission from the surface. It was an automated message, left behind like a note from a predator to its next victim. A human voice spoke in their crude language, but the translation software converted it to Valkyrie instantly. We knew you were coming, and we know where you are going next, so run. The message ended, and silence filled the command deck. Juran stared at the screen for a long moment before forcing his expression back to calm authority. This changes nothing, he announced to his shaken crew. The humans are clever, but cleverness means nothing against overwhelming force, and we will simply be more cautious at the next target. He ordered the fleet to regroup and set course for the next human colony, a mining world called Iron Deep. Surely humans could not have rigged every single one of their worlds to explode. As the fleet entered hyperspace once more, Juran told himself that New Harvest had been a fluke, an anomaly that would not be repeated. But deep in his mind, a question lingered that he could not silence. The humans had known the fleet was coming before it even arrived, and they had prepared a response that killed thousands of Valkyrie soldiers without risking a single human life. What kind of species fought like this, and what else were they prepared to do? Juran did not have answers, but he pushed the questions aside and focused on the mission ahead. The Dominion had conquered species far more dangerous than humans, and a few clever traps would not change the final outcome. He was certain of this truth with every fiber of his being. What he did not understand, what he could not yet comprehend, was that the humans had been watching his fleet for months before it ever crossed into their territory. They knew his route, his targets, and his tactics, and they had planned responses for all of them. The trap at New Harvest was not a desperate defense thrown together by frightened colonists. It was the first move in a strategy that had been designed years ago by minds that thought about war very differently than the Valkyrie. High Command had told Juran that humans were psychologically predictable, that they had been wrong about everything. The humans were not predictable at all. They were patient and they were vengeful, and they never fought a battle they had not already won in their minds before the first shot was fired. By the time Juran realized this truth, it would already be far too late. The invasion of human space had begun with fire and death, but not the fire and death that the Valkyrie had planned. Somewhere in the dark between stars, Admiral Chen Weilin received reports of the New Harvest detonation and allowed herself a small smile. The first phase was complete, and the enemy had entered the trap exactly as predicted. Now it was time for Phase 2, and the Valkyrie would learn what it truly meant to invade human space. They had come expecting conquest, but they would find only ghosts, shadows, and a reckoning that would echo across the galaxy for 1,000 years. 6 months had passed since the invasion began, and High Arbiter Juran had conquered 15 human worlds without losing a single major battle. On paper, the campaign was a tremendous success that would be celebrated across the Dominion. In reality, Juran had never been more afraid in his entire life. Every world his forces captured was empty when they arrived, stripped of resources and population. The humans seemed to know exactly when and where the Valkyrie would strike, and they vanished like morning mist before the sun. But that was not the worst part, because the worst part was what happened after the conquests. Ships disappeared from the fleet with no explanation and no warning. One moment a cruiser would be traveling in formation, and the next moment it would simply be gone. Sensor logs showed nothing unusual, and distress calls were never sent. Entire crews of hundreds vanished without a trace, and the empty ships were never found. Engineering decks suffered catastrophic failures that defied all probability. Reactors overloaded, life support systems malfunctioned, and navigation computers plotted courses directly into asteroid fields. Food synthesizers on 3 different ships began producing toxins that killed everyone, wait before anyone realized what was happening. Rumors spread through the fleet like a disease, and soldiers whispered about human psychic weapons and invisible assassins. Morale plummeted as warriors who had never known fear began jumping at shadows and refusing to eat. Commander Ishathar was one of the few officers who refused to believe in supernatural explanations. She was a strategist by training, and she knew that every effect had a cause that could be understood. While others prayed to the old gods for protection, Ishathara gathered data and searched for patterns. She noticed that the accidents and disappearances always happened when Valkyrie attention was focused elsewhere. A ship would vanish during a staff meeting, a reactor would overload during a supply inventory, and a navigation system would fail during a crew rotation. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Ishathara began investigating the backgrounds of crew members who had been near each incident, and what she found chilled her blood. Every single incident could be traced back to a Valkyrie servant, the low-caste workers who cleaned the ships, prepared food, and maintained minor systems. These servants came from conquered species that the Dominion had absorbed centuries ago, and no one ever paid attention to them. But when Ishathara looked closer, she found something impossible. The genetic records of 17 servants showed traces of human DNA hidden beneath cosmetic modifications. These were not Valkyrie servants at all, and they were not members of any conquered species. They were humans who had been surgically altered to infiltrate the Dominion decades before the invasion even began. Ishathara realized the horrifying truth that the humans had planted operatives inside Valkyrie society 30 years ago. These ghosts had lived among the Dominion for their entire adult lives, waiting for this moment, waiting for the order to begin their silent war. She rushed to warn High Arbiter Joran, but she never reached him. Her message was intercepted by a servant who had served on her ship for 12 years, a quiet and unremarkable worker named Keth, who always brought her evening meals. Keth was not Valkyrie, and he never had been. He was Lieutenant Marcus Chun of Earth Coalition Intelligence, and he had been waiting for someone to discover the truth. He could not allow that warning to reach Joran, so he activated the fail-safe protocols. Across the fleet, other ghosts received the signal and understood what it meant. The quiet phase of the operation was over, and now it was time for the loud phase. The Valkyrie had established a forward command base on Stellar Station, a captured human orbital that now housed 50,000 occupation troops. It was supposed to be the safest location in human space, protected by multiple defensive systems and thousands of armed soldiers. At exactly 0300 hours, the station died. Every airlock opened simultaneously, venting the atmosphere into the vacuum of space. Emergency bulkheads that were supposed to seal automatically remained locked open, and escape pods launched themselves empty before anyone could reach them. Soldiers woke up gasping and choking, scrambling for emergency suits that had been mysteriously moved from their storage locations. Some made it to the evacuation points, only to find the doors sealed from the other side. Others fought their way to shuttles that exploded the moment they tried to activate the engines. The entire station became a tomb in 11 minutes, and 48,000 Valkyrie died screaming in the silent darkness of space. The surviving 2,000 soldiers had been in a sealed section that the ghosts had deliberately left intact. When they finally broke through to the command deck, they found a message carved into the metal floor with a plasma cutter. "We were here first." Joran received the news while sitting in his private quarters, and for a long moment he could not process what he was hearing. 50,000 soldiers dead in a single night, killed not by human warships, but by humans who had lived among the Valkyrie for decades. How many more were there, and where were they hiding? He looked at his own servants, the workers who brought his food and cleaned his chambers, and he felt a terror he had never known before. Could he trust any of them, and could he trust anyone at all? Paranoia swept through the fleet like a plague, and soldiers began attacking their own servants on suspicion alone. Innocent workers were killed by frightened warriors who saw human assassins in every shadow. Discipline collapsed as officers refused to eat food they had not prepared themselves, and crews abandoned their posts to search for infiltrators. The invasion had not stopped, but it had become something nightmarish. The Valkyrie were no longer hunting humans, because now the humans were hunting them. Every corner could hide an assassin, and every trusted face could belong to an enemy. Joran tried to restore order, but how could he command soldiers who trusted no one? He sent increasingly desperate reports to the Dominion Council, begging for reinforcements and support. The council responded with disappointment and threats, telling him to stop making excuses and complete the conquest. They did not understand what was happening in human space, and they did not believe his warnings about infiltrators. After all, no species had ever managed to place operatives inside the Dominion undetected. The idea that primitive humans could accomplish such a feat was ridiculous to them. Ishathara survived the purges because she had not yet told anyone about her discovery. She watched from the shadows as the fleet tore itself apart from within, and she understood something that Joran did not. The humans had not just planned for this invasion. They had been preparing for it for 30 years, placing assets in position and waiting for the Valkyrie to take the bait. The whole thing was a trap, and the Dominion had walked into it with arrogance and pride. Ashathura began keeping a private record of everything she witnessed, knowing that someday someone would need to understand how the mighty Valkyrie had been defeated by a species they had dismissed as primitive. She wrote about the ghosts, the empty worlds, and the psychological warfare that was destroying the fleet more effectively than any weapon. If she survived this war, she would make sure the galaxy knew the truth. The humans had not won through superior technology or greater numbers. They had won through patience, planning, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. They had placed their pieces on the board decades ago, and now they were simply collecting the checkmate they had earned. By the time the Valkyrie realized what was happening, the humans had already struck again, and they would keep striking until there was nothing left to strike. Admiral Chan Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Phantom's Edge, and watched the holographic display that showed the position of every Valkyrie ship in human space. For 6 months, she had commanded from the shadows, coordinating the resistance while the enemy believed they were winning. Now it was time for the galaxy to learn how humanity truly fought its wars. She activated a transmission that would broadcast across every communications frequency in human space, knowing that Valkyrie intelligence would intercept it immediately. That was exactly what she wanted. This message is for High Arbiter Joran and the warriors of the Valkyrie Dominion. She began in a calm and measured voice. You have invaded our territory, and you have conquered our worlds, and you believe you are winning this war. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. You are wrong. For 6 months, you have chased ghosts across empty planets while your soldiers died in their beds and your ships vanished in the night. You call us primitive, but we have been watching you for months before you ever crossed our borders. We knew your routes, your targets, and your tactics before you launched a single ship. This is the doctrine of preemption, and it is how humanity fights. We do not wait to be hit, and we do not react to attacks. We act first, strike second, and vanish before the enemy knows they are bleeding. You thought you invaded us, but the truth is that we invited you in. Every world you captured was a trap, and every victory you celebrated was a defeat you could not see. Now the real war begins. The transmission ended, and Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before turning to more urgent matters. While the Valkyrie had been busy occupying empty human colonies, a small task force had been traveling in the opposite direction. 12 stealth frigates had crossed 400 light-years of space to reach a target that no one believed humans could threaten. Velkar Prime, the throne world of the Dominion itself. Captain Sarah Okonkwo commanded the task force, and she had been preparing for this mission for 15 years. She and her crew had trained in secret facilities, learned the Valkyrie language, studied their defenses, and memorized every detail of the target. They were not here to attack the planet, because 12 frigates could not scratch a world protected by thousands of defensive platforms. They were here for something much more valuable. The Dominion coordinated its entire military operation through a network of 200 communication satellites orbiting Velkar Prime. These satellites connected every fleet, every garrison, and every outpost in the Empire. Without them, the Valkyrie military would be deaf and blind. Okonkwo's frigates emerged from hyperspace on the dark side of the planet's largest moon, hidden from the defense grid by rock and radiation. They deployed specialized missiles that had been designed for this exact purpose, weapons that looked like space debris on any scanner. The missiles drifted toward the communication network at a speed slow enough to avoid detection, taking 12 hours to reach their targets. When they finally struck, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. 200 satellites exploded in perfect synchronization, and the entire Dominion communication network collapsed in an instant. For 72 hours, the Valkyrie Empire would have no way to coordinate military operations across its vast territory. Ships could not receive orders, fleets could not share intelligence, and commanders could not call for reinforcements. High Arbiter Joran received the news with a mixture of disbelief and rage. The humans had attacked the homeworld, and they had done it while he was occupied with their worthless colony planets. He tried to contact the Dominion Council for instructions, but his transmission disappeared into the void without response. He tried to reach other fleets for support, but the communication relays were dead across every system. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Valkyrie Dominion was completely disconnected from itself. And the humans had planned for exactly this moment. Across every conquered world, sleeper cells activated simultaneously. The colonists who had fled were never truly gone, and they had left behind networks of resistance fighters who had been waiting for the signal. On Iron Deep, miners emerged from hidden tunnels and attacked the garrison with improvised weapons and desperate courage. On New Harvest, the survivors of the initial evacuation returned in small ships and began targeting supply convoys. On every planet the Valkyrie believed they controlled, humans rose up and struck at their occupiers. Supply depots burned in the night, troop transports exploded in mid-flight, and isolated patrols simply vanished. The Valkyrie garrisons tried to respond, but without communication, they could not coordinate their defenses. Each garrison fought alone, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain and had nothing left to lose. Poisoned water supplies killed thousands, and sabotaged vehicles stranded thousands more. By the time the Dominion's communication network was finally restored, Joran had lost 60% of his ground forces. 150,000 soldiers dead, and not from any great battle. They had been killed by farmers and miners and factory workers who refused to accept defeat. Joran stood on his bridge and stared at the casualty reports with empty eyes. He had won every engagement, captured every objective, and achieved every goal the Dominion had set for him. And he was losing the war more completely than any commander in Valkyrie history. The humans had never tried to stop his invasion, because stopping it was never their plan. They had lured him deep into their territory, stretched his supply lines to the breaking point, and then cut him off from any hope of support. Now his fleet was trapped in enemy space with diminishing resources and a population that would never stop fighting. Admiral Chun's transmission echoed in his memory, mocking him with its truth. We act first, strike second, and vanish before the enemy knows they are bleeding. He finally understood what those words meant. The humans had been fighting this war for years before his fleet ever launched. They had placed their assets, built their networks, and prepared their strategies while the Dominion was still debating whether to invade. By the time the first Valkyrie ship crossed into human space, the outcome was already decided. Juran was not a conqueror, and he never had been. He was a piece on a game board, moved by human hands according to human plans. Everything he thought he knew about this war was wrong, and every assumption he had made was a mistake. The Dominion Council finally managed to restore contact with him, and their message was filled with fury and accusation. They demanded to know how he had allowed primitives to attack the homeworld, and they threatened him with disgrace and execution. Juran listened to their threats and felt nothing but exhaustion. They did not understand what he was facing, and they probably never would. The humans were not primitive, and they were not weak, and they were not afraid. They were something far more dangerous than anything the Dominion had ever encountered. They were patient, they were smart, and they fought without honor or mercy. And by the time anyone realized what they were truly capable of, they had already struck again. High Arbiter Juran stood before the Dominion Council as a broken commander presenting a desperate proposal. 1 year had passed since the invasion began, and the campaign was a disaster that threatened to become the greatest humiliation in Valkyrie history. The Ninth Conquest Fleet had lost 2/3 of its strength, and the survivors were demoralized and paranoid. Human insurgents controlled the territory that Juran had supposedly conquered, and his supply lines were under constant attack. The council members looked down at him with disgust and contempt, waiting for him to explain his failures. But Juran had not come to apologize. He had come to propose the only solution that could still save the Dominion's honor. The humans cannot be conquered through conventional means, he admitted without shame. They do not fight like any species we have faced before, and they will not surrender no matter how many worlds we take. But they still have one weakness that we can exploit. He activated a holographic display showing a blue and green world orbiting a yellow star. Earth, he declared, the human homeworld and the source of their resistance. If we destroy Earth, the colonies will lose their coordination and their will to fight. Without their origin world, the humans will collapse into chaos and despair. The council members exchanged uncertain glances, because what Juran was proposing had not been done in thousands of years. The Valkyrie conquered worlds for their resources and populations, and destroying a planet meant destroying its value. But Juran pressed forward with growing intensity. I am requesting authorization to deploy the Corvette fleet, he announced. Shocked whispers filled the chamber at the mention of that name. The Corvette were world-killer vessels, massive ships designed for sustained orbital bombardment that could render any planet uninhabitable. They had not been used since the ancient wars, and many believed they should never be used again. But the council was desperate, and Juran's plan offered a way to end the war quickly and decisively. After hours of debate, the authorization was granted. 200 Corvette vessels were pulled from their hidden docks across Dominion space, escorted by 300 warships. Juran personally commanded the fleet as it departed for human territory using a secret route that avoided all known patrol zones. If the humans learned about this fleet before it reached Earth, they would have time to prepare a defense. The journey would take 3 weeks through little-traveled hyperspace corridors, and every moment of delay increased the risk of discovery. Commander Ishathura watched the preparations from her position on the periphery of the fleet. She had survived the chaos of the past year by keeping quiet and staying useful, but she had never stopped gathering information. Everything she learned confirmed her worst fears about this war. The humans were not just winning through clever tactics. They were winning because they understood something the Valkyrie did not. Wars were not decided by territory or resources or even casualties. Wars were decided by will, and the humans had more of it than any species Eshethera had ever studied. She knew the Corvith attack would not end the war, because destroying Earth would only make the humans fight harder. But Juran and the Council could not see this truth, because they had never faced an enemy like humanity before. Eshethera made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She composed an encrypted message containing the fleet's route, timetable, and composition, and she transmitted it on a frequency she had discovered in the Ghost Network's communication protocols. She was betraying her people to the enemy, and she knew that if she was discovered, she would be executed as a traitor. But she also knew that if the Corvith reached Earth, billions would die for nothing, and the war would continue until both civilizations were destroyed. Someone had to stop the madness, and the humans were the only ones with the power to do it. A message was intercepted by a ghost operative who had infiltrated the Dominion's communication center years ago. Within hours, it reached Admiral Chun Wei-Lin on the other side of human space. The Admiral read the intelligence report and immediately understood its implications. The Valkyrie were coming to destroy Earth, and they were coming through a route that would avoid all standard defenses. But they were also coming through a route that passed directly through the Acheron Nebula, a region of ionized gas that disrupted sensors and communications. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Chun assembled the Phantom Fleet, 90 ships that represented humanity's most advanced stealth technology. They traveled at maximum speed to the Acheron Nebula and hid themselves among the swirling gases and radiation clouds. And then they waited. Eshethera's betrayal was discovered 3 days before the fleet reached the nebula. A routine security scan detected anomalies in the communication logs, and the trail led directly back to her console. She was arrested, interrogated, and scheduled for immediate execution. But before the sentence could be carried out, she was brought before Juran for a final confrontation. "Why?" he demanded with rage burning in his eyes. "You were one of my most trusted officers, and you betrayed everything our people stand for." Eshethera looked at him without fear or regret. "I betrayed nothing," she replied calmly. "I tried to save our people from a war we cannot win. The humans are not our enemy, and they never were. We invaded their space because we thought they were weak, but we were wrong about everything. If we destroy Earth, they will not surrender. They will become something worse. They will hunt us across the galaxy until there is nothing left of the Dominion but ashes and memories." Juran struck her across the face, but she did not flinch. "You are a fool and a coward," he spat. "Execute her immediately." Eshethera was led away to her death, but her message had already changed the course of history. The Corvith fleet entered the Acheron Nebula with confidence, unaware that death was waiting in the swirling clouds. Juran stood on his bridge and watched the sensors struggle against the nebula's interference. They were nearly blind in here, but that was acceptable because no one knew they were coming. Or so he believed. Admiral Chun gave the order, and 90 human ships decloaked simultaneously around the Valkyrie formation. Antimatter warheads streaked through the nebula in perfect coordination, targeting the Corvith with devastating precision. 180 world killer vessels exploded in the first 3 minutes of the engagement. The surviving 20 tried to scatter, but the human ships were faster and more maneuverable. One by one, the Corvith were hunted down and destroyed before they could escape the nebula. Juran's flagship was crippled by a direct hit to the engine section, and he found himself drifting helplessly while human ships circled like predators. A transmission came through on his personal frequency, and Admiral Chun's face appeared on his screen. "High Arbiter Juran, she said with cold satisfaction in her voice. You invaded our space, and you came to destroy our world. Did you really think we would let you leave? Juran had no answer, because he finally understood the truth that Ishithora had tried to tell him. The humans had known about his plan from the beginning, and they had let him come so they could destroy him completely. By the time he realized the trap, they had already struck again. And this time, there would be no escape. 18 months after the invasion began, the human fleet arrived at Velkaw Prime. 400 warships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their shields raised. But they were not alone. Alongside the human vessels flew ships from a dozen other species, races that had suffered under Valkyrie rule for centuries and now saw their chance for freedom. The Dominion's throne world had never been threatened by an enemy fleet in its entire 12,000-year history. Now it faced the combined might of every civilization it had ever wronged. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of the Phantom's Edge and watched the planet grow larger on her view screen. This was the moment she had worked toward for her entire career, the moment when humanity would prove its place among the stars. But she did not order an attack. Instead, she activated a broadcast that would reach every corner of the Valkyrie homeworld. This is Admiral Chen Wei-Lin of the Earth Coalition Combined Fleet. She announced in a voice that carried across continents. Your empire invaded 847 species over 12,000 years, and you enslaved billions of innocent beings. Today, that ends. Surrender your military forces, release your slaves, and accept responsibility for your crimes. Do this, and we leave your world in peace. Resist, and we stay here forever. The choice is yours, but know this. We did not come here to negotiate. We came here to win. The Dominion Council convened an emergency session to discuss the impossible situation. For the first time in history, they were not the conquerors, but the conquered. They demanded to speak with High Arbiter Juran, hoping he could provide intelligence about human weaknesses or negotiation strategies. Juran was brought before them in restraints, a prisoner who had been captured at the Acheron Nebula and held aboard Admiral Chan's flagship. He was thin and pale, broken by months of captivity and the weight of his failures. The council looked at him with disgust and demanded answers. Tell us their weaknesses, they commanded. Tell us how to defeat these humans. Juran laughed, and it was the sound of a soul that had given up all hope. There are no weaknesses, he replied in a voice hollow with despair. We believed humans were divided, but they unified the moment we attacked. We believed them primitive, but they outhawed us at every turn. We believed them afraid, but they fought as if death meant nothing. We invaded their space, and by the time we realized our mistake, they had already struck again. And again. And again. He looked at the council with eyes that had seen too much horror and too much truth. I have watched our soldiers die by the hundreds of thousands, killed by farmers and miners who refused to surrender. I have seen our greatest fleet destroyed in minutes by ships that appeared from nowhere. I have learned that everything we believed about humanity was wrong, and everything they said about themselves was true. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber. Surrender now, before they teach the rest of the galaxy what they taught me. The council members exchanged looks of shock and fear, because they had never heard a Valkyrie commander speak this way. Juran had been one of their finest warriors, and if he believed the war was lost, then perhaps it truly was. The debate lasted for hours, but in the end, there was only one possible decision. The Valkyrie Dominion transmitted its surrender to the human fleet. Military forces would stand down, slave species would be freed, and war crime tribunals would be established to bring justice for 12,000 years of conquest. Admiral Chun received the transmission and allowed herself a moment of pure relief. The war was over, and humanity had won. But winning was only the beginning. because now came the harder task of building a peace that would last. She met privately with the new Valkyrie leadership, civilians who had risen to power after the military government collapsed. They expected threats and demands, humiliation and revenge. Instead, Chun offered them something they had never given to their own victims. "We did not come here to destroy you," she said quietly. "We came here to stop you from destroying others. The Dominion as you knew it is finished, but your people can still have a future. Join us as partners in a new galactic order, where no species conquers another and all beings are free. Help us build something better than what came before, and we will help you heal from what you have done." The Valkyrie leaders stared at her in disbelief, because mercy was a concept their culture had abandoned thousands of years ago. But Chun was not offering mercy out of weakness. She was offering it because she understood something the Valkyrie never had. True strength was not measured by how many enemies you destroyed, but by how many you turned into friends. Humanity had proven it could fight, and now it would prove it could build. The peace process took years, but it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Slave species were freed and given territories of their own, and the Valkyrie economy was rebuilt around trade instead of conquest. War criminals were tried and punished, but ordinary citizens were given chances to participate in the new order. And through it all, humanity stood at the center, not as conquerors, but as mediators, teachers, and allies. Admiral Chun retired from military service and returned to Earth, where she spent her remaining years writing about the war and advocating for peaceful expansion. She received a message from her granddaughter on New Harvest, the colony that had been the first to fall and the first to be rebuilt. "Grandma, when are you coming home?" Chun smiled at the simple question that meant so much. For years, she had fought to protect humanity's future, and now the future was bright and full of promise. She replied with a single sentence that carried all her hope and love. "Soon, the fighting is finally over." 100 years later, a young Valkyrie historian named Kethara researched the Human Dominion War for her doctoral thesis. She interviewed the last surviving veteran of the 9th Conquest Fleet, an ancient warrior who had been a junior officer during the invasion. He was frail and close to death, but his mind was still sharp with memories of those terrible days. Kethara asked him the question that had driven her research from the beginning. "What was the moment you knew the war was lost?" The old warrior was silent for a long time, his eyes distant with remembering. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "The moment we entered human space. We just did not know it yet. The humans did, because they always knew. And by the time we realized the truth, they had already struck again." He closed his eyes, and Kethara thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he spoke one final time. "The Dominion believed we were conquering a primitive species, but we were wrong about everything. The humans were not primitive, and they were not afraid, and they never forgot an injury or a threat. They waited for us, and they planned for us, and they defeated us before we ever knew the war had begun. That is what they taught us, and that is what the galaxy will always remember. Never invade human space, because by the time you realize your mistake, the humans will have already struck again." The old warrior died 3 days later, the last of his generation to witness the fall of an empire. His words became the final lines of Kethara's thesis, a warning to future civilizations who might be tempted to threaten humanity. The humans had proven their place among the stars, not through cruelty or conquest, but through cunning, courage, and an unbreakable will to survive. They had turned invasion into liberation, enemies into allies, and war into lasting peace. And they had taught the galaxy a lesson that would never be forgotten. When you attack humanity, you do not catch them by surprise. They have already planned for your attack, prepared for your strategies, and positioned their assets for victory. By the time you realize you are losing, they have already struck again. That is what it means to be human, and that is why humanity will endure among the stars forever.